Thank you for joining ThreatInSight for our first 2026 Global Risk Overview. We trust that you will find the content helpful. If you have further questions or comments, you are welcome to reach out to our business development team. We also have a structured dashboard that contains more granular socio-economic and political data, which is very helpful for contextualization of the various risks. For this, you are welcome to reach out to our analytics team. This review is structured as a top-down overview. I will start by providing a brief introduction of the global risk landscape, then drill down to look at North America and South America, then Europe and Asia, including Oceania. We will then consider the Middle East, North Africa, the Sahel region, Sub-Sahara Africa, and along the way, we will touch on BRICS, Nato, and other relevant topics. We will end the review by exploring the opportunities these risks bring to the business landscape. We also weave into each vertical layer 8 risk topics to allow for a truly comprehensive risk view. These topics include risks associated with crime, political, social, and economic instability, geo and environmental risks, and risks associated with war, civil war, and terrorism. Often there is an interlinking between multiple threat topics, and we attempt to highlight this where there is a definitive cause and effect relationship, or where the one risk topic serves as a catalyst for another. This is a risk review and not a news broadcast. Our aim is to review threats holistically and to analyze this clinically. We do not assume that any viewpoint is either correct or false, and we engage with the subject matter in aid of identifying the possible impact it holds for our clients, while also trying to identify the opportunities stemming from the risk. At times, a little more historical background is needed to provide sufficient context, and, in this regard, we distilled historical facts down to its essence. From a global perspective, the United States of America dominated the global risk landscape during 2025 and is expected to continue this throughout 2026. For the most part, it has had a mostly negative impact on the global landscape, serving more as a destabilizing force than a status quo disruptor. Statements made by the United States Secretary of State, Mr. Rubio, affirms our assessment that this process of destabilization is intentional. Mr. Rubio stated that the rules-based international order had to be jettisoned because it had been built on a false assumption that a foreign policy serving core national interests could be replaced by one that served the liberal world order, that all the nations of Earth would become members of the democratic Western-led community, with humankind now destined to abandon national identity and become one human family and citizens of the world. This was not just a fantasy. We now know it was a dangerous delusion. The United States' response to this perceived threat is forcing new military and economic alliances. Some of these new alliances enforces greater polarization, which destabilizes post-World War II diplomatic and militaristic peace efforts. The United States is establishing a new world order under the Trump administration, a world order in which the United States of America is no longer the global custodian of peace through negotiation facilitation, but is now taking in an active role in enforcing a dominant United States-driven solution. Throughout the global community, it is felt that the United States are disregarding the sovereignty of states, which is now forcing alliances which would have remained casual. However, with many sovereign states viewing actions by the United States as undermining their sovereignty, several anti- or counter-United States alliances are entered into, which is exacerbating polarization and is undermining global cohesion and stability. In this regard, we see the expansion of BRICS to include Iran as a full member, with partner countries such as Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam joining, and countries such as France and Canada reported to be in active negotiations with BRICS countries. If included as either members or partner countries, it would represent a major shift in the socio-economic and political dynamics of the G7. The more aggressively the United States are implementing their evolving foreign policy, the more pressure there are on other nations to find a counterbalance. Add to this the uncertainty created by an American foreign policy and its inconsistent application. An example would be the back-and-forth statements of the White House around Russia, China, and Palestine, to name a few. In the light of the United States' evolving foreign policy, traditional allies like NATO countries no longer feel that they can rely on support from the United States, and is therefore either building new alliances or are now starting to make decisions without the United States. The United States' aggressive stance with regards to calling for the integration of Greenland into the United States of America effectively positions NATO to act against itself and is creating a new geopolitical pressure point. While statements made by Vice President J.D. Vance about the nuclear capability of France and the UK and how a population demographic change in their population is considered as a serious threat to the security of the United States further undermines the NATO relationship. The Christmas Day bombing of ISIS in the north of Nigeria is also elevating retaliatory threats against the United States' interests throughout the world. The full extent of the risk is yet to be determined. It also seems, from more recent intelligence feedback, that the United States offensive impacted on villages with no current or historical ISIS presence. This reflects, as with the Iran bombing on 22 June 2025, badly on both the intelligence accuracy and military strike efficiency of the United States, emboldening its enemies. This makes for a volatile situation. The United States blockade of Venezuelan oil and the escalating tension between the two countries resulted in condemnation from China, Russia, and United Nations rights experts. Due to an oversupply of oil by Iran and Russia, there is no immediate supply chain impact anticipated with the United States' action in Venezuela, but it does create yet another pressure point. Evidence that the supply chain remains intact is reflected in the Brent crude oil price remaining stable at $61.32, which is trading $2.64 higher than on December 16th. Although this is 4.5% higher, it is $11.53 lower than for the same period a year ago. The war between Russia and Ukraine, however, is placing a heavy financial burden on European countries who are providing financial and armament support, while also expected to increase their contribution to NATO to ensure NATO's readiness to respond to emerging threats. The Kremlin spokesman, Mr. Dmitry Peskov, openly stated that the foreign policy of the Trump administration largely aligns with the vision of Russia, which is, within the context of recent United States actions, causing concern across NATO-aligned countries. The Russia-Ukraine does hold the risk for a supply chain disruption if Ukraine is successful in disrupting Russian crude oil supply to North Korea, China and India, while the Venezuela blockade remains in place. This will have a direct price impact on the Brent crude oil price, impacting the global economy negatively. The more recent military intervention in the north of Nigeria by the United States could also escalate, attracting large-scale sabotage as acts of terrorism, disrupting Nigerian oil supply to France, Spain, India, China and the Netherlands. Tension is also increasing between the European Union and the United States of America on issues ranging from its visa ban to the United States' pressure on the International Court of Justice. This is further complicated with the United States placing a 2027 deadline on European countries to take over the largest budget share for NATO. Reading this together with the United States' September ultimatum to Europe, in which the United States agreed to introduce harsh sanctions on Russia, subject to NATO countries abandoning all oil imports from Russia, insisting on the European Union imposing tariffs of between 50 and 100% on countries which still purchase Russian oil. This would include harsh tariffs on China, Turkey and India, amongst others. However, the use of tariffs as a political pressure mechanism is prohibited in the European Union trade policies, while trade between the European Union and China exceeds $800 billion, which will undermine European economic stability. It is, therefore, an unrealistic and provocative demand with little to no possibility of success. At the same time, the United States Energy Secretary, Mr. Chris Wright, is seeking commitments from the European Union to acquire any resulting oil and gas shortfall directly from the United States. The extent of the diplomatic crises caused by the Trump administration through these various actions must be viewed within a diplomatic historical context. Soon after the Second World War ended, the world entered the Cold War with the primary theatre of war playing out in Europe, but with two key tension areas, North America and China each supporting one of two sides. At its most simplistic, the world was divided into various forms of democracy and free market, capitalist, economics on the one side, and Marxist, socialist, communist ideals on the other side. The European, or as it was known, the West's strategy was essentially based on Liddell Hart's indirect approach, which favoured long-term political stability over direct confrontation. Eastern Europe, for the most part, followed a similar approach with what they termed peaceful coexistence diplomacy. After the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, non-confrontational diplomacy remained intact, while we saw a clear increase in covert operations as the world adjusted to a new reality. These covert operations evolved over time to include psychological warfare centered in disinformation, and more recently into cyber warfare with disruptions in trade, communication, and critical infrastructure. Parallel to this, both ideological sides aggressively financed regime changes throughout Africa and the Middle East, which caused power vacuums, and in turn served as a catalyst for terrorism, destabilizing vast geographical areas. Throughout this period, non-confrontational economic warfare was balanced with a commitment to diplomacy. Then during 2025, the United States escalated the status quo by abandoning non-confrontational economic warfare. It openly confronted nations with punitive tariffs, demanding favourable rates and long-term agreements, while also interfering with local political and economic policies. It did this not along mutually agreed diplomatic principles to reach an acceptable settlement, but it acted in a non-diplomatic fashion dictating terms and conditions. This approach abandoned diplomacy and the principle of non-confrontational actions by mobilizing the global economy as a battleground while taking on a physical confrontation posture. During 2025, the United States openly threatened 8 countries with military action. These are Greenland, Canada, Mexico, Panama, Venezuela, Nigeria, Iran and Palestine, and initiated a military offensive by mobilizing attacks in 2 of those countries, namely Iran and Nigeria. The situation prompted Europe to invite Canada to participate in the European Union's Security Action for Europe framework, an initiative that gives Canada access to defence financing and procurement mechanisms, something from which the United States remains excluded. This is a substantial escalation of tension in between the 2 neighbouring states. When Canada paused its F-35 fighter jet purchases to explore alternative defence technology transfer between itself and Sweden, the Unites publicly hint that trade and economic ties with Canada could hinge on Canada continuing with the F-35 purchase. This prompted the Canadian public and political leaders to conclude that the United States are viewing alliance not in terms of equal exchange and respect for national autonomy and sovereignty, but as a means of coercing Canada into an American view of its defence future. Looking more closely at the United States political, social and economic landscape, and we see that the United States economy showed resilience with better than expected gross domestic product performance, which is calculated using the expenditure approach. For the United States, the gross domestic product is the sum of consumer spending plus government spending plus investments plus net exports. This means that the inflationary effect of tariffs on consumer spending, on the one hand, plus the pressures of tariffs to reduce imports while maintaining the same level of exports, on the other hand, provides for a synthetic gross domestic product value. This interpretation is supported by the fact that core inflation was consistently above 2% throughout the year, climbing as high as 2.8% during the third quarter. The impact of new tariffs contributed to ongoing price pressures, translating into increased consumption figures, with about 60% of the cost assumed to be passed on to consumers. Its labour market cooled significantly, with a monthly average of only 55,000 jobs created, representing a 67% drop compared to the previous year, and bringing the unemployment level to 4.6% at the end of November 2025. At the same time, the consumer confidence slid in December due to anxiety over high prices and tariffs. Public distrust and objection to the socio-economic and political disruption within the United States is seen in the number of formal protests. According to data collected and maintained by Harvard University, there has been 29,138 protests, with total attendance exceeding 5.1 million protesters between 1 January and 30 September 2025. This averaged roughly 107 protests per day. For context, during Trump's first term in 2017, over the same period, there were only 8,314 protests recorded. The present level is therefore 350% higher. For a further comparison, viewing the United States adjusted protest numbers to that of South Africa, considering both in terms of the number of protests per day per 1 million population, we see that South Africa, during its peak, records around 0.25 protests per day per 1 million population, whereas the current protest level in the United States averaged 0.35 protests per day per million population. This is 40% higher than South Africa at its peak back in 2017. The November 2026 midterm elections holds both risks and opportunity for the United States and by implication for global stability. Key risks include political gridlock, government shutdowns, and potential election interference. Analysts warn of possible misuse of federal agencies and deployment of armed forces under the Insurrection Act, which could intimidate voters and disrupt ballot counting. There exists, however, an opportunity for the US electorate to rebalance power through the midterms. Democrats need a net gain of 4 seats to reclaim the Senate, while early 2025 polling shows a 14-point Democratic lead in House generic ballots. The re-establishment of congressional oversight is critical, and if the Democrats do win either chamber, they will gain subpoena power over executive agencies, providing for improved checks and balances on the Trump administration's second-term actions. Given the risk of losing unilateral control, we can therefore expect that the Trump administration will expedite many of their current initiatives with greater disruption within the United States and on the global stage. However, due to the need for the president to re-enter campaign mode, we can expect some divided attention, resulting in a lack of follow-through. Narcotic crime in the United States remains a priority crime. The 2025 National Drug Threat Assessment released by the Drug Enforcement Agency highlights fentanyl and methamphetamine trafficked by the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels as primary threats operating out of Mexico. Venezuela, for the most part, serves as a transport hub for Colombian drugs transported to nearby Caribbean islands like Trinidad and Tobago, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, from where it is transported to Europe. There is no evidence linking Venezuela directly with transporting drugs to the United States. Europe is also not without its challenges. The Russian war in Ukraine continues to dominate the military risk within Europe. The war is currently nearing the 4th year of full-scale conflict. Ukraine has received to date around $175 billion in aid from the United States and an additional $197 billion from the European Union, with little evidence of a ceasefire or more long-term solution on the horizon. The Russia-Ukraine war has resulted in 53,000 civilian casualties, with 3.7 million people displaced and 12.7 million people in need of humanitarian assistance on the Ukraine side alone. On the Russian side, the cost is reported to be even greater. Russia has recorded 388 civilian deaths, with 120,000 people displaced from the Kursk region. An additional 800,000 people emigrated from Russia for economic or political reasons, representing an emigration level equal to 0.6% of the Russian population. Through military reporting and third-party surveillance, it is estimated that Russia has lost as much as 1,200,000 combatants. This comprises 300,000 deaths and 900,000 severely injured. Returning veterans with no real economic options are turning to violent crime, which undermines both economic growth and social cohesion. On the economic front, punitive measures against Russia includes the freezing of 340 billion central bank reserves. Additionally, around $200 billion were lost due to sanctions on the Russian financial industry and an additional $79 billion in energy exports. It is estimated that as much as 1/6 of Russian fuel production facilities are no longer operational. By 1 January 2025, close to 500 companies exited Russia. During the past year, the Russian economy grew by 1.4% and is forecast to decline, resulting in a 1.2% growth expected for 2026, well below the Russian economy's potential. The number of corporate bankruptcies in Russia increased by 26% during the past year. At the same time, Europe's economy has shown some resilience, but with modest growth of around 1.4%. This outperformed initial forecasts despite several United States tariffs being enforced. Inflation remains under control, hovering just above the 2% target. The 2026 economic growth forecast for the European Union is set at between 1.2 to 1.4%. Inflation close to the 2% target, with unemployment expected to remain below 4.9% mark. Investment, however, is expected to remain modest and will focus on digital and green transition while aiming to boost competitiveness through innovation and efficiency. The drugs market within the European Union is estimated to generate roughly €30 billion per year, making it the most profitable segment of organised crime within the Eurozone. For context, this is roughly equivalent to 7.9% of the European Union's military budget and around 0.2% if the Eurozone's GDP. The zone collectively spends around €282 billion per year fighting crime. Europol estimates that more than 1/3 of criminal networks active in Europe are involved in the production or trafficking of drugs, which places the budget allocation to around €94 billion for drug-related law enforcement only. This is roughly 3 times the value of the income generated by the crime itself. Growth in the drug market combined with the entry of new players have intensified competition, which in turn fuels violence as a method of control and market dominance. Europol also noted that these criminal networks are focusing on the recruitment of minors, often through social media platforms, offering small payments or status in exchange for carrying out violent acts, including assaults and killings. The practice has been described as violence as a service and highlights how digital technology are reshaping the operational landscape of organised crime. Besides the production, manufacturing and distribution of illicit drugs, the drug industry supports and fuels several other crime types. These include violence, money laundering, corruption, human trafficking, fraud, theft, robbery, forgery and burglaries. At its most extreme, it is utilised to fund regional and national conflicts, including civil war, while at a domestic level it translates into assault, domestic violence and child abuse and neglect. Politically, Europe, as with the United States of America, has shown a tendency to migrate towards a more right-wing political landscape. At present, far right-wing parties are leading roughly 30% of countries, and as such hold an equivalent sway in the European Parliament. For now, centrist parties still maintain a majority, while left-wing parties see mixed results but remain influential. Far right-wing parties exert significant influence in Germany, France, Italy, Hungary and the Netherlands. Crossing over the Indian Ocean, we see that Asia's political landscape is entering a period of major uncertainty and transition during 2026, with leadership transitions in Vietnam, Thailand and Myanmar. 2026 will see continued geopolitical realignment, efforts to manage internal pressures, and the balancing of domestic economic needs against global trade shifts, with potential for both stability in some areas and increased instability in other areas. Southeast Asia will experience some tension due to leadership transitions in Vietnam, Thailand and Myanmar, while there will be relative stability in Malaysia and the Philippines. In East Asia, China remains the key power and economic driver, and it is expected that it will continue to find ways through which to balance its domestic demand and industrial policy. Its military assertiveness, especially around Taiwan, serves as a pressure point in the region. Recently, after the United States announced a $10 billion defense transaction, including the supply of medium-range missiles and drones, to Taiwan, China responded by imposing sanctions against the following 20 United States defense companies: Northrop Grumman Systems Corporation, L3 Harris Maritime Services, Boeing's Defense Branch, Gibbs & Cox, Advanced Acoustic Concepts, VSE Corporation, Sierra Technical Services, Red Cat Holdings, Teal Drones, Reconcraft, High Point Aero Technologies, Epirus, Dedrone Holdings, Area Y, Blue Force Technologies, Dive Technologies, Vantor, Intelligent Epitaxy Technology, Rhombus Power, and Lazarus Enterprises. It further imposed sanctions on 10 United States business executives associated with these companies. The result is an increased tension between the United States and China. Central Asia remains relatively stable, but do face ongoing demographic, resource, and geopolitical pressures. In South Asia, Pakistan is facing several internal and external challenges. Cross-border insurgency and hostile exchanges with Afghanistan remains a burning topic, while India, Sri Lanka, the Maldives and Bhutan are seen as relatively stable countries in the region. Economically, Asia is expected to grow between 4.2 and 4.3, present with an aggregate inflation in the order of 2.9%, while unemployment is expected to remain around the 4.5% mark. Crime throughout Asia seems to focus on the convergence of organised crime and technology, with an expected rise in AI-supported cyber scams and human trafficking associated with cybercrime operations. The drug-related trade in Asia generates around $130 billion, with an anticipated growth in the manufacture and distribution of synthetic drugs from the Golden Triangle, comprising the mountainous region between Myanmar, Laos and Thailand. Panning over to the Middle East, we see continued political instability centered around geographical Israel, with primary conflicts between Israel, Syria, Lebanon and Yemen. By extension, this includes Iran, who is accused by Israel of fighting a proxy war with it through Syria, Lebanon and Yemen. Israel have once again turned to the United States with a request for assistance with a direct offensive with Iran, something which Netanyahu is expected to repeat during his visit with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago. However, the Trump administration has indicated that this does not align to its current objectives for the Middle East. Tension is also rising between Israel and the United States, centered around the United States sale of 48 F-35 fighter aircraft to Saudi Arabia. This forms part of a $142 billion agreement between the two countries. This transaction is critical for the Trump administration, as it will boost income in the much-needed manufacturing sector. Israel, however, argues that the sale of such aircraft technology to other Middle Eastern nations has the potential to erode Israel's qualitative military edge, which is a principle enshrined in United States law. This principle requires Washington to ensure Israel retains a clear military advantage over potential regional adversaries. Israel, however, remains adamant that it must intervene to prevent Iran from reaching its goal for military-grade nuclear material and the possibility of deploying it as a long-range weapon. This follows the 12-day war during June 2025 and Iran's statements that its nuclear enrichment plants remain intact. More recently, Behruz Kamalvandi, a spokesperson for the Iran nuclear effort, stated that if Iran would decide to construct nuclear weapons, that it would be a simple task and that there are no further significant barriers. It is expected that if the United States won't act against Iran, that Israel will initiate another offensive against Iran early during 2026. It is also reported that the Trump-negotiated ceasefire in Palestine has not been adhered to by Israel. Continued offensive actions into Gaza is undermining global peace efforts for the region. Israel continues to reject a two-state solution in the face of a global insistence of the establishment of such a solution. With United States pressure on South Africa to withdraw its genocide case mounting, and threats by Israel that it will cripple the South African economy, South Africa remains steadfast in its approach. As international support increase on this front, with Belgium being the most recent country to join the case, together with Brazil, Colombia, Ireland, Mexico, Spain and Turkey, the United States has ramped up its pressure on South Africa. Pressure has been in the form of additional tariffs, threats for exclusion from the AGOA initiative, and excluding South Africa from participating in the G20 held in the United States during 2026. Other Middle Eastern conflicts are centered around the Sudan civil war, which remains a catalyst for instability in the region, and the instability in Iraq caused by large-scale corruption, sectarian division, a power vacuum, and ISIS activities in the country. On the economic front, the regional GDP is expected to rise to 3.3%, with inflation hovering around 2% across the Gulf region, with unemployment tracking stable roughly 11%. However, the Middle East remains a significant hub for the production, trafficking and consumption of illicit drugs, leading to a rise in organised crime, violence and public health issues. Captagon, an amphetamine-type stimulant, is the most prominent drug, with production centred in Syria and Lebanon, with high demand in the Gulf states for this drug, particularly in Saudi Arabia. Money generated from the sale of drugs are laundered in aid of financing terror and arming private militias throughout the region and into North Africa. Neighbouring the Middle East, North Africa's political landscape continues to be a combination of authoritarianism with persistent regional stability under threat due to socio-economic pressures and security threats from the Sahel. Major powers like the United States, China and the Gulf states seek ways to extend their influence in the region. There remains, however, deep structural strains exacerbated by youth demographic pressures, which increases the risk of disruptive protests. Changes in United States foreign policy create space for new diplomatic avenues to develop, which may change the dynamics across North Africa. Regional economic outlook for 2026 is cautiously optimistic, with growth between 3.9% and 4.4% expected. The International Monetary Fund is forecasting a 10.3% inflation rate with a sub-30% unemployment rate. Algeria demonstrates strong potential due to investor-friendly policies and energy sector growth. Its economic diversification alongside that of Egypt and Morocco has the potential to facilitate growth, recovery and stability throughout the region. Libya has the potential to show significant growth as it operates from an existing low base due to historical instability and socio-economic decline. On the crime front, North Africa faces significant challenge with transnational crime syndicates in play. Financial crimes, the cannabis trade and human and arms trafficking remains dominant challenges for 2026. The existence of a crime intelligence vacuum, combined with a lack of skilled and technology-proficient investigators, are frustrating regional crime prevention initiatives, as drug and arms trafficking is known to finance terrorist and insurgent groups, impacting on national security across the region. There is an urgent need to address these deficiencies. Between North Africa and Sub-Sahara Africa is a vast, semi-arid transitional zone across Africa known as the Sahel region. It stretches from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea and included countries such as Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, and Nigeria. The Sahel region continues to face an increase in extremist violence from groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda across parts of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. It is stretching state capacity, causing vital resources to be redirected, which results in the general collapse of service delivery, which further destabilizes the region through need and distrust in the government's ability. The socio-political stability is further eroded through an escalating humanitarian crises and displacement, and increased rivalry between Morocco and Algeria fueled by climate stress, weak governance, and reduced foreign aid. The instability caused by this results in an increase in protests and further instability, creating a self-feeding cycle. In recent years, instability across the Sahel region has shown to spill over into neighbouring countries, towards both the north and south, increasing the risk of terrorism, insurgency with serious and violent crime, finding new routes and areas to dominate. Economically, the Sahel region has a generally positive outlook for 2026, with economic growth forecast somewhere between 4 and 7%. The region, however, do face challenges related to climate shocks, safety and security instability with foreign terror risk and insurgency undermining economic recovery and growth. Inflation across the region remains around 12.6%, while unemployment rates in certain sectors are as high as 85%. Reliable consolidated data is not readily available, but youth unemployment is estimated to be around 30%, which further fuels instability. On the crime front, the Sahel region faces severe crime challenges where crime exploits sparse crime intelligence, weak governance, poverty and climate change to fuel instability, using the proceeds of crime to finance terror activities as a means of creating political instability. The region serves as a major transit route for cocaine to Europe and arms trafficking through Libya. It also serves as a human trafficking and migrant smuggling corridor and is a logistical backbone for illicit gold and fuel trade, which undermines tax revenue collection of various countries, further undermining political and economic stability. Kidnap for ransom is an established activity used to further finance terrorism and organised crime syndicates, with students and worshippers being targeted. Sub-Sahara Africa includes most of the continent's countries, south of the Sahara Desert, encompassing around 48 nations like Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Angola, DRC, Tanzania, plus island states such as Madagascar, Mauritius and Cape Verde. These nations face significant and somewhat systemic political challenges like political instability, weak governance, corruption and undemocratic rule, often stemming from colonial legacies. The result is constrained economic growth that leads to a lack of service delivery and an increase in conflict. Opportunistic agencies such as ISIS and other radical Islam terror groups seek to capitalize on the inefficiencies of governments by establishing themselves within the region, thereby further undermining safety, security and stability across the region. The region, however, is forecasted to demonstrate strong economic growth for 2026, with a growth rate of between 4.2 and 4.6%. Inflation across the region ranged between 3.9 and 10.9%, with the median rate expected to be around 3.9 to 4%. The youth unemployment rate across the region remains very high at 30%, while the overall unemployment rate across the region peaks at around 32% in South Africa. Organised crime continues to pose a significant risk throughout the region, with well-established crime operations that are fully entrenched within the various countries. South Africa, Nigeria and Kenya have various mafia-style criminal networks operating not only within those countries but also across borders into neighbouring communities. The region has seen an exponential growth in cybercrimes, including online fraud, ransomware and distributed denial of service attacks. On the more violent side, human trafficking, smuggling and resource crimes such as illegal mining is prevalent throughout the region. Arms and drug trafficking remains lucrative, with heroin from Afghanistan dominating the southern and East Africa drug trade, while cocaine supply is also showing both a supply and consumption increase throughout the region. Zooming into the region's most established economy, that of South Africa, which faces several challenges. In 2026 it will have its local elections, this being the first election since the creation of the Government of National Unity. The election will provide an indication to the Democratic Alliance and other parties in the Government of National Unity of how their participation has shaped public perception and support. On the political front, the continued engagement with the Trump administration by AfriForum and Solidarity is fueling tension between the United States of America and the South African government. Although AfriForum and Solidarity denies that they made any claims of a white Afrikaner genocide, thereby stating that this is an invention by Trump, counter-evidence has been presented that shows AfriForum has made genocide claims on social media as far back as 2010 and again in 2013. There is also no evidence that they corrected Trump on the matter. The possible impact this situation will have on South Africa in terms of loss of opportunities and possible sanctions could hold severe consequences for the AfriForum and Solidarity management. A more pragmatic assessment of the situation leads me to conclude that the White House is using AfriForum and Solidarity as a proxy to exert pressure on the African National Congress and the South African government to withdraw its genocide claim against Israel at the Court of International Justice. If Trump truly believed a white Afrikaner genocide was taking place in South Africa, there would be no hard annual refugee limit. What the AfriForum, Solidarity and Trump situation achieved is to place the government's broad-based black economic empowerment and land expropriation policies and laws in the spotlight. Equally important is the focus on government's less than stellar performance related to crime prevention, investigation and prosecution. This provides an opportunity for both business and the public to engage with government in aid of finding a workable solution that will ensure economic investment and inclusion for all and sustained growth. The United States midterm elections, which are scheduled to take place in November 2026, is expected to result in a power rebalancing by curbing much of the decision freedom the Trump administration has enjoyed for the past year. This means that we will see continued pressure from the White House, most likely through the United States Ambassador to South Africa, Mr. Leo Brent Bozell, from early 2026 up until November. The fallout between the African National Congress as the main drivers behind the Israel genocide case will put pressure on the party's financial ability to contest the local elections in 2026, as well as the national elections in 2 years. Historical Jewish funding to the African National Congress is expected to be further reduced. At the same time, the Democratic Alliance has been careful to maintain a more favourable stance towards Israel, refusing to support the genocide claim, thereby ensuring that traditional Jewish sponsors are not alienated. South Africa's membership of BRICS and its support for a mechanism through which trade can be divorced from the United States dollar is serving as a further burning point, fueling the breakdown of diplomacy between South Africa and the United States. We see similar tension exist between the United States and other BRICS countries. With Iran joining BRICS in 2026, the hostility and diplomatic breakdown between the BRICS nations and the Trump administration can only worsen. On the economic front, South Africa's economy has once again shown much resilience in the light of the Trump tariffs and other pressures exerted during 2025. Forecasts during early 2025 downwardly adjusted growth to below 1%. However, South Africa exhibited much resilience, seeing a 2.1% third quarter year-on-year growth, which averages the South African growth rate for the year settling at around 1.2%. This is 0.2% higher than the risk-adjusted forecasts and is like the growth forecast for the country pre-Trump. The South African government and local producers were quick to act in finding alternative offset markets in Europe and Asia, meaning that once the Trump administration initiated its punitive tariff strategy, South Africa had already mitigated much of the anticipated risks and impact. Growth for 2026 is forecasted to be even more robust, reaching somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6%. Economists have highlighted that for South Africa to obtain growth above 2%, it will need to accelerated reforms. Inflation is expected to be somewhere between 3.5 and 4%, while unemployment will remain alarmingly high at 32%. During late 2025, South Africa's credit rating was positively adjusted for the first time in 2 decades. The Standard & Poor's rating changed from BB- to BB for foreign currencies and to BB+ for local currencies, both with a positive outlook. The crime landscape will continue to centre around high levels of violent contact crimes, the deep entrenchment of organised crime syndicates, and the rise of cyber and financial crimes. Focused efforts by the financial industry and law enforcement in establishment of robust controls to detect and combat terror financing and money laundering resulted in the removal of South Africa from the grey list in October 2025, demonstrating another positive win for the country's economy. Although the South African terrorist threat is very low, subdued growth and non-optimal military budget allocation has left South Africa somewhat vulnerable. This is being addressed with an increase in military spend, as well as a manpower replacement strategy to ensure that we develop and maintain a functional military. In summary, we will now briefly look at the countries facing the highest risk across the various risk types. In the political instability category, there are 9 countries identified that will face major political challenges during 2026. These include Sudan, which is currently experiencing a brutal civil war with expanding regional spillover and mass atrocities. Occupied Palestinian territories, where an ongoing conflict makes basic living conditions challenging. South Sudan, with an increased risk of a renewed civil war due to prolonged conflict in the immediate region, severe food insecurity, and the potential withdrawal of international security assistance. Ethiopia, with ethnic tensions intensify and regional flashpoints, particularly with neighbours like Eritrea over Red Sea access, remain unresolved. Myanmar being wrapped up in a fragmented conflict resembling anarchy, with more than 1,200 distinct armed militia groups actively fighting the central government. Haiti being subjected to widespread gang rule and a sustained humanitarian crisis. Syria, which is facing internal fragmentation and jihadist dissent in the post-Assad period. Lebanon, experiencing government destabilization due to economic failure and ongoing conflict with Israel. And Bangladesh, experiencing major civil unrest after its democratic reset, combined with high regulatory uncertainty. In the climate risk category, we have 8 countries identified which will be severely impacted during 2026. The Philippines, being ranked as the world's most disaster-prone country, expected to remain in the grips of typhoons, floods and rising sea levels. Dominica, who remains at risk of powerful hurricanes. Myanmar, who experiences frequent and devastating cyclones and floods. Honduras, being subjected to a high frequency of hurricanes, tropical storms and landslides. Chad, being exposed to extreme heat and desertification alongside devastating flash floods, all impacting on production and food security. India, facing several climate-related extreme weather threats ranging from severe heat waves to recurring floods. Bangladesh being subjected to rising sea levels combined with extreme flooding. And St. Vincent and the Grenadines being subjected to the same extreme environmental threats related to a combination of rising sea levels and extreme tropical storm activity. On the economic front, we have 6 countries facing significant challenges. These are Sudan, whose economy remains in a state of total collapse due to the ongoing civil war. The conflict has decimated infrastructure, halted domestic production, and created the world's largest displacement crisis, rendering the central economy largely non-functional. Afghanistan, which is now projected to be the world's poorest country, with a gross domestic product per capita of only $445, which is only about $1.20 per day. This is the result of extreme international isolation, the loss of foreign aid, and severe restrictions on female participation in the workforce. Yemen being in a similar position as Afghanistan, with a marginally higher gross domestic product per capita, resulting from decades of economic blockades and negligible industrial capacity, combined with extreme food insecurity. South Sudan, who is heavily dependency on oil exports, which are frequently disrupted by regional instability and internal conflict. Lebanon, with a constrained financial system, a devalued currency, and constant exposure to regional military tensions. And finally, Turkey, a well-established economy, subjected to runaway inflation exceeding 18.5%, which is eroding local purchasing power and economic growth. From a crime perspective, there are 7 countries that are severely impacted by crime, each experiencing the impact differently. These countries include Myanmar, identified as the country with the highest levels of crime across the globe. It faces a combination of human trafficking, arms smuggling, and trading in synthetic drugs. Haiti, subjected to roughly 200 different gangs ruling large portions of the country and building their criminal enterprise around capital control, kidnapping, and targeted violence against the general population. Venezuela, having to deal with well-established organized crime syndicates with a focus on armed robberies and kidnappings, combined with drug trafficking. Colombia being a leader in the illicit cocaine trade combined with violent protection racketeering. Mexico's crime landscape ruled by sophisticated cartel networks specializing in extortion, arms trafficking, and the synthetic drug trade. South Africa, being the continental hotspot for organized crime in Africa, with a sharp rise in cyber-dependent crimes, ransomware, and extortion, and Ecuador exposed to a surge in gang violence and drug-related homicides. The next vertical risk type is civil war, and here again we have 8 countries with an extreme likelihood. These countries include Sudan, which is already caught in a brutal civil war with no reasonable expectation that it will end during 2026. South Sudan, with its post-2018 civil war recovery remaining fragile, and many of the agreed terms currently unravelling, which has already led to sporadic factional infighting and renewed conflict. Myanmar, currently overrun by various well-armed militias operating across all territories throughout the country. Ethiopia, with rising domestic tensions in the Tigray, Amhara, and Oromia regions serving as regional and ethnic flashpoints, combined with the potential for cross-border clashes with Eritrea over Red Sea access. Syria, having experienced a year of political changes combined with sectarian violence, is nearing the tipping point for a resurgent civil war. Haiti, being subjected to gang violence with pushback from security forces, are fueling the likelihood of further destabilization, with an increased risk of the violence turning inwards. Democratic Republic of the Congo has a fragile peace in the east, where violence perpetrated by the M23 group, backed by Rwanda, is creating a volatile environment. The most recent Trump-facilitated peace deal is not holding, with M23 continuing its advance on the city of Uvira, and Lebanon, where failed efforts to disarm Hezbollah combined with continued Israeli military strikes are creating a volatile environment which could easily ignite a wider sectarian conflict during 2026. Where civil war focuses on the internal conflict within a country between its population, war is an external cross-border risk. Here we have 5 key conflicts. These are the Russia and Ukraine war, that holds a moderate likelihood of spilling over into neighbouring NATO countries, which will effectively drag NATO into a war with Russia. Tension between China and Taiwan could lead to a crisis in which the United States intervene in aid of Taiwan. Such a scenario would place the United States into a direct conflict with China. Tension between North Korea and South Korea could boil over, which is a potential conflict that will draw the United States into a regional conflict in Asia, and which will also draw Russia into the conflict due to a bilateral agreement signed between North Korea and Russia during June 2024. Continued escalation between Venezuela and the United States could escalate into an armed confrontation with Venezuela. Here both China and Russia have expressed their caution, with Russia committing to direct support for Venezuela. And finally, there remains a credible and high probability of a renewed military conflict between Iran and Israel. A prolonged and sustained offensive between Iran and Israel will make Israel vulnerable for attacks from Egypt, Syria and Lebanon, which will necessitate an intervention from the United States of America. Considering the bilateral agreements entered into between the United States of America, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Israel, the pressure Trump places on Europe and the strategic oil and energy supply corridors the United States are attempting to control, such as Venezuela and Nigeria, it is logical to conclude that the United States are positioning itself strategically to respond to any conflict by controlling much of the supply line. The second last vertical we are discussing is terrorism, and here we have 6 primary countries with an elevated terror risk, and the United States added as a 7th. The reasons for including the United States will be discussed in more detail. The primary high-risk countries include Burkina Faso, which remains the epicenter of violence in the Sahel, with jihadist expansion from various groups following the withdrawal of Western military support. Pakistan, who records in excess of 1,000 terror attacks per year, particularly along its border with Afghanistan. Syria, following the resurgence of ISIS and ongoing instability caused by shifting foreign influences and internal conflict. Mali being caught in a vicious power struggle. Nigeria with an increase in attacks from Boko Haram and the Islamic State, with the recent military attack by the United States further fueling anti-American tension and increasing the efforts by these groups. Israel simply due to its continued involvement in several regional wars. And lastly, the United States of America due to high visibility events such as the FIFA World Cup, the G20 and its midterm elections being held in the United States during 2026. Our last vertical speaks to social protests and the countries which will be severely impacted by protests, riots and general social disorganization during 2026. Here we have the United States of America, which has become known for both the frequency of protest events and the size of these events. The midterm elections are anticipated to fuel an even greater increase in mobilization. With the National Guard deployment progressively across several states, there exists a possibility that any of these events may devolve into an event with extreme violence. Bangladesh has seen the mobilization effect of what has become known as the Gen Z revolt, and this is expected to continue due to the success these protests have had during 2025. Pakistan will continue to face mass demonstrations as the underlying causes has not yet been resolved. France has, in recent years, emerged as Europe's hotspot for protests, and it is anticipated that this will continue to be the case, while Indonesia will continue to experience protest volatility as a spillover from 2025. Diving a little deeper into the most prominent crime types emerging and which will start to dominate the crime landscape during 2026, we see the following. Artificial intelligence-enabled fraud and scams has already made some inroads, but with the technology maturing during 2025, we can expect a much more organised and focused attack during 2026. Cybercrime as a service, where artificial intelligence malware autonomously scans for and exploits zero-day vulnerabilities without human intervention. Transnational organised crime, and in specific drug manufacturing and trafficking, with an emphasis on synthetic drugs like fentanyl and cocaine. Automation of scam centres resulting in human trafficking. It is anticipated that this will be mostly located in Southeast Asia, West Africa and Central America. Cyber attacks focusing on critical infrastructure and global logistics supply chain disruption. This will see a convergence of nation-state actors and criminal gangs. Misinformation and disinformation, aimed at destabilising governments or damaging company brands by controlling the narrative. This is aimed at fueling social polarisation, which can be exploited. A final summary of several high-risk events which may be exploited either by focused actors pursuing a strategic intent or by opportunistic actors hoping to serve as a catalyst. In this category we have the following subcategories: elections, sport events and socio, political and economic events, and I will briefly list those high-risk events under each. Elections or United States midterm elections to be held in November 2026, or Israel elections to be held in October 2026. Netanyahu will need to convince the Trump administration to, at the very least, back his planned offensive against Iran. If he cannot secure this, he will be vulnerable during the election, and losing his position will hold a twofold risk for him. He will no longer be able to navigate around his bribery and corruption trial internally, but will also have very limited movement options outside of Israel due to the International Court of Justice arrest warrant issued for him. This also means that the pressure on South Africa to withdraw its case will intensify greatly during 2026. South Africa will have its local government elections. The date is yet to be announced by the President. United Nations Security Council election. Iraq presidential election. Lebanon general election. Danish general election. French Senate election in September. Russia legislative election. And United Kingdom local elections on 7 May. Sport events. Australian Open in January. Winter Olympics is Italy during February. Winter Paralympic Games held in Italy during March. Boston Marathon in April. French Open during May and June. FIFA World Cup held in the United States during July. Wimbledon during June and July. Commonwealth Games in Scotland during August. Sydney Marathon in August. US Open in September. And the Ironman World Championship in October. Socio-political or economic events. G7 Summit in France 14 to 16 June. G20 Summit in Miami 22 to 23 November. World Economic Forum held in Davos 19 to 23 January. BRICS Summit held in India 25 to 28 March. NATO Summit 7 to 8 July in Turkey. In closing, the world for 2026 is certainly filled with its challenges. However, with every challenge, we are also presented with unique opportunities. The most obvious opportunities are to actively find new markets. expand product ranges to be more focused on the real and emerging threats to ensure that we remain competitive, and to actively participate at a national level, engaging with government through the various forums created, to ensure that the decisions our governments make are aimed at creating a stable economic environment conducive for the growth and development of economic opportunities for all. It is easy to be swept up in the emotion of the various dynamics of the political landscape and the uncertainty that it creates. But it will be worthwhile to remember that this is how the world has functioned, at the very least, since the end of the Second World War, and that although certain elements are now more visible, much of this was taking place more covertly in the past. If we refocus our attention to find unique opportunities for us, much that is positive will come from all the instability that is currently present. Thank you for the opportunity to present this global risk overview, and we trust that you found at least some of the answers, with the relevant context, to assist your organisation to navigate through the complexities. If you would like to engage with us, please don't hesitate to reach out to our business development team, who can be reached via email or phone.